Unbroken, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption by Laura Hillenbrand. Picture this, nothing but water stretching to every horizon. It's day 27. Somewhere on the endless, shimmering Pacific, a young American airman named Louis Zamperini is clinging to life on a tiny, disintegrating rubber raft. His body, once sculpted by Olympic training, has withered to little more than bones wrapped in burned, salt-crusted skin. Two other men drift beside him, the last survivors of a plane crash nearly a month ago. They're utterly, devastatingly alone on 64 million square miles of ocean. The search parties have given up. As far as the world is concerned, they're already dead. Then, through the haze of exhaustion, they hear it, the distant, thrumming pulse of engines. A plane. Hope explodes through them like electricity. Louis fumbles for a flare and shoots it skyward, a desperate red streak against the blue. The plane keeps going. Their hearts sink as it disappears over the horizon. But wait, the sound returns. It's circling back. They've been spotted. With arms like brittle sticks, they wave frantically. They shout with voices cracked from thirst. The plane drops low, skimming alongside them. Louis can make out the dark silhouettes of the crew inside. This is it. They're saved. Then the world erupts in violence. The water around them explodes in a fury of bullets and spray. This isn't a rescue plane. It's a Japanese bomber, and they're being hunted. What unfolds in those next terrifying moments and in the brutal years that follow is more than just a survival story. It's a journey into the deepest chambers of the human spirit. It poses a question we all carry somewhere inside us. When everything is stripped away, what remains? When you're pushed beyond what you think you can endure, what makes you choose to see another sunrise? Today we're diving into one of the most extraordinary true stories ever recorded, Unbroken, by Laura Hillenbrand. This book has captivated millions of readers worldwide, not because it's merely a war story, but because it reveals the almost unbelievable resilience hidden in one man's soul. Laura Hillenbrand, who also gave us the magnificent story of Seabiscuit, is a master of meticulous research. She spent 7 years reconstructing this account, interviewing Louis Zamperini more than 75 times, combing through dusty archives, and speaking with the men who lived alongside him. What emerged is nothing short of breathtaking. By the time we finish today, you'll understand not just what it means to survive, but what it means to remain truly, deeply, spiritually unbroken. This isn't only Louis Zamperini's story, it's a revelation of what you too might be capable of when faced with the impossible. So let's begin. Before the Olympics, before the war, Louis Zamperini was basically a one-boy crime wave, a professional troublemaker, if you will. Growing up in 1920s Torrance, California, as the son of Italian immigrants, Louis was an absolute whirlwind. He started smoking at 5, was drinking by 8, and would steal anything that wasn't bolted down. Missing pie from a windowsill? Keg disappear from a party? Everyone knew exactly who to blame. Pretty much all his childhood stories ended the same way. And then I ran like hell. He was clever, fearless, and completely wild. His parents, Anthony and Louise, were at their absolute wits' end. The police became regular visitors to their door, but there was one person who saw something more beneath all that chaos. His older brother, Pete. Pete was everything Louis wasn't: popular, responsible, admired. Everyone, including Louis, looked up to him. And Pete believed, with every fiber of his being, that his wild little brother had something extraordinary inside him. He noticed Louis's talent for running from trouble and thought, what if he ran towards something instead? so Pete made it his personal mission to turn Louis into a runner. At first, Louis absolutely hated it. He complained, dragged his feet, quit repeatedly. But Pete refused to give up. He'd ride his bicycle behind Louis during training sessions, literally whacking him with a stick to keep him moving. Louis's first race was a complete disaster. He finished dead last and hid under the bleachers in humiliation. But Pete pushed him to try again. Then something clicked. Louis started winning. The applause, the recognition, the electric feeling of crossing the finish line first. It was addictive. All that energy he'd poured into mischief, he now channeled into running. He quit smoking and drinking. He trained obsessively, running to and from school, running to the beach and back. He'd run into the hills chasing wild horses just to feel his body in motion. Running gave him something he'd never known before: peace. The restless, angry boy began to transform into a focused, disciplined athlete. And he wasn't just good. He was phenomenal. They called him the Torrance Tornado. In 1934, at the Southern California Track and Field Championship, Louis ran the mile in 4 minutes and 21.3 seconds, absolutely shattering the national high school record that had stood for nearly 20 years. He was so smooth, so fast, that people started talking about the impossible, the 4-minute mile. At just 17, he was among the world's greatest runners. His next target was audacious: the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Louis was too young and inexperienced for the mile, his signature event, so he aimed for the 5,000 meters, a much longer, more grueling race he'd only run a handful of times. But at the Olympic trials in New York, during a brutal heat wave that had other athletes collapsing, Louis ran the race of his life. In a photo finish with America's greatest distance runner, Don Lash, Louis made the team. At 19, he became the youngest American distance runner ever to qualify for the Olympics. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were a massive spectacle, orchestrated by Adolf Hitler to showcase his vision of Aryan supremacy. For a poor kid from Torrance, it was like stepping onto another planet. On the ship to Germany, Louis discovered the endless free food and gained 12 pounds in 9 days. In Berlin, Louis knew he didn't have a realistic shot at a medal against the seasoned Finnish runners who dominated the 5,000 meters. But in the final race, something ignited inside him. After running in the middle of the pack for most of the race, he remembered something Pete once told him: "A lifetime of glory is worth a moment of pain." With that thought burning in his mind, Louis unleashed a final lap so spectacular it left the crowd, and even Hitler himself, watching in amazement. He ran that last lap in just 56 seconds, a speed virtually unheard of in a distance race. He finished 8th, but his explosive finish was the talk of the day. Afterward, he was told that the Führer wanted to meet him. Standing before Hitler's box, Louis reached up as Hitler extended his hand. Through an interpreter, Hitler said, "Ah, you're the boy with the fast finish." Louis, ever the troublemaker, celebrated by climbing the Reich Chancellery and stealing a Nazi flag right from under the guards' noses. The 1936 Olympics were behind him, but he left with a new dream blazing in his mind: gold in 1940 in Tokyo. Back in America at the University of Southern California, Louis dominated track and field. He was faster, stronger, more unstoppable than ever. The 4-minute mile seemed within reach. The world was his. But the world was also sliding toward war. In 1937, Japan invaded China. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The 1940 Olympics were canceled. Louis was adrift. The singular focus of his life had vanished. For the first time since he'd started running, he didn't know where he was headed. Like countless young men of his generation, his path led him to war. Despite a deep fear of flying from a childhood flight, Louis joined the Army Air Corps. He washed out of pilot training, but was drafted back to become a bombardier. He was assigned to a crew led by a quiet, steady pilot named Russell Allen Phillips, whom everyone called Phil. They flew the B-24 Liberator, a plane so clumsy and mechanically unreliable that crews grimly nicknamed it the Flying Coffin. In October 1942, Louis, Phil, and their crew flew their B-24, which they'd named Superman, across the Pacific to Hawaii. Their war had begun. Their first taste of combat was a daring Christmas raid on the Japanese-held Wake Atoll. The mission succeeded, and the men felt invincible. But the reality of their new life was brutal and unforgiving. In the Pacific theater, for every plane lost in combat, 6 disappeared in accidents. The B-24 was notoriously difficult to fly, especially when ditching in the ocean. Its high wings and fragile bomb bay doors meant that if it hit water, it would likely break apart and sink instantly. Every man knew the statistics. They all knew friends who'd vanished on routine flights, swallowed by the vast, empty ocean. In April 1943, during a bombing raid on Nauru Island, Superman was savaged by Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The plane was shredded with nearly 600 holes in its skin. Half the crew was wounded, and one man, Harry Brooks, was killed. With hydraulic lines severed and rudder cables spliced together with bomb-arming wire and no brakes, Phil somehow nursed the bomber back to base and landed it, a feat of airmanship bordering on miraculous. The crew was shattered. Their beloved plane was destroyed. They were given a replacement, a beat-up B-24 that had been cannibalized for parts. It was notoriously difficult to fly, so mushy in its controls, it felt perpetually on the verge of stalling. Its name was the Green Hornet. Louis flew in it once and hoped never to again. On May 27, 1943, that hope died. A plane had gone down near Palmyra Atoll, and a search mission was being mounted. The only available plane was the Green Hornet. Louis, Phil, and their crew were reluctant, but orders were orders. Just before leaving, Louis scribbled a note and left it on his footlocker. "If we're not back in a week, help yourself to the booze." Several hours into the search, hundreds of miles from land, one of the Green Hornet's left engines sputtered and died. The plane tipped and began falling. As the crew scrambled to feather the dead engine to reduce drag, the engineer, in a moment of panic, hit the wrong button. He feathered the other left engine. With both engines on one side dead, the plane was doomed. It rolled into a spiral and plunged toward the ocean. Phil's last words over the interphone were calm and final: "Prepare to crash." Louis scrambled toward his crash station, pulling a life raft in front of him as a cushion. He tucked his head into his chest, and in the last instant before impact, a single thought pulsed through his mind: nobody's going to live through this. The crash was a cataclysm of breaking metal and rushing water. Louis was thrown forward, then felt himself being dragged deep underwater, tangled in a mess of wires that had snapped loose when the plane broke apart. He thrashed against them but was hopelessly trapped. His lungs burned, the pressure built, the world faded to black. He passed out. He woke in total darkness, still sinking inside the fuselage. He was swallowing salt water, tasting blood and fuel. He was drowning. He flung his arms out, and his college ring snagged on something, the frame of the open waist window. He pushed off, tore himself free, and kicked for the surface. He burst into daylight, vomiting water. All around him floated a field of debris. He heard a voice and saw Phil and another crewman, Sergeant Francis McNamara Mac, clinging to floating wreckage. Phil's head was bleeding heavily. Of the 11 men aboard the Green Hornet, they were the only survivors. Louis spotted one of the plane's life rafts, inflated and drifting away. He swam for it, catching the trailing cord just before it slipped from reach. He pulled himself aboard, then rowed to a second raft and tied them together. He paddled over to Phil and Mac and hauled them from the water. They were alive, but they were lost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with almost nothing. The survival provisions in the rafts were pathetically inadequate. All they had were a few half-pint tins of water, several bars of military-issue chocolate, a flare gun, a patch kit, and a few other small items. No radio, no navigation tools, no way to signal for help beyond the flares. Louis took inventory and established the rules: 1 square of chocolate in the morning, 1 in the evening, and only a few sips of water daily. At that rate, their supplies might last a few days. Surely a rescue search was already underway. The first night was cold and terrifying. Sharks, drawn by the crash, began circling the rafts, their fins slicing the surface. They were so close the men could have reached out and touched them. As they tried to sleep, they could feel the sharks rubbing their rough backs along the bottoms of the rafts. When Louis woke the next morning, he made a devastating discovery. During the night, in a fit of panic, Mac had eaten all the chocolate. Their only food was gone. Days turned into a week, then 2. The equatorial sun was merciless, burning their skin and swelling their lips. Their water ran out. They were parched, starving, beginning to waste away. Their bodies became covered in salt sores. Louis, refusing to surrender, kept his mind active. He quizzed Phil and Mac on every subject he could think of, trying to keep their minds sharp. He recounted his life story, and Phil did the same. Every day he described, in exquisite detail, his mother's cooking. He'd walk them through each step of a recipe: the smell of the sauce, the feel of the dough. The imaginary meals were so vivid they almost fooled their stomachs. They were creating something to live for. But Mac was slipping away. He was consumed by guilt over the chocolate and lost in quiet despair. Then rain came. They caught it in the canvas cases that held the air pumps, sucking up the precious water and spitting it into the tins. They caught a few small fish, and, in one desperate, daring moment, Louis snatched an albatross that landed on his head. They couldn't stomach the tough-smelling meat, but they used it for bait. Hope came and went in cruel flickers. On day 27, the Japanese bomber appeared, strafing them and leaving one of their rafts in tatters. Louis had to fight off sharks with his bare hands while hiding underwater. Miraculously, none of them were hit. The attack, as terrifying as it was, gave them crucial information. Based on the bomber's likely range, they calculated they'd drifted over 1,000 miles and were now deep in enemy territory, nearing the Marshall Islands. They guessed they might reach land in another 3 weeks. The days bled together in a haze of suffering. They caught a few more birds. Louis, in a fit of rage after a shark tried to jump into the raft, managed to catch a small shark with his bare hands. They ate its liver, their first real meal in weeks. But they were fading. On day 33, Mac died. Louis and Phil gently wrapped his body and slipped it into the sea. Louis and Phil drifted on, 2 living skeletons. Their bodies were digesting themselves. On day 40, Louis heard something impossible, the sound of a choir singing. He looked up and saw, in the clouds, the silhouetted figures of 21 people, their voices raising a beautiful, celestial song. Phil saw and heard nothing. Whatever it was, it belonged to Louis alone. On day 46, just as Phil had predicted, they saw it. A low, gray-green smudge on the horizon. Land. As they neared, a typhoon descended, tossing their fragile raft up 40-foot swells and nearly capsizing them. They survived the night, and in the morning woke in the calm waters between two small islands. As they began paddling for shore, a boat appeared, turned, and sped toward them. On its deck were Japanese sailors, their rifles aimed at the castaways. After 47 days, 2,000 miles, and the loss of one of their own, Louis and Phil's ocean ordeal was over. A new, and in many ways worse, ordeal was about to begin. They were taken to an atoll in the Marshall Islands. At first, their captors were surprisingly kind, giving them food, water, and medical care. But then they were told they were being transferred. The name of their destination sent a chill through Louis Kwajalein, the place POWs called Execution Island. At Kwajalein, the kindness evaporated. Louis and Phil were thrown into tiny, filthy cells. On the wall of his cell, Louis saw an inscription: 9 Marines marooned on Macon Island, August 18, 1942. Below were their names. Louis was almost certainly the first American to learn their fate. A local told him they'd all been executed. For 42 days, Louis and Phil endured a nightmare of starvation, beatings, and medical experiments. They received only a few ounces of food and a couple of sips of water daily. Guards taunted them, spat on them, threw scalding water in their faces. Louis, suffering from severe dysentery, withered away. He carved his name on the wall next to those of the dead Marines. Looking at his own body, he thought, "All I see is a dead body breathing." He believed he would die there. But the Japanese had other plans. Because he was a famous Olympian, they saw him as a valuable propaganda tool. Instead of executing him, they sent him and Phil on a long ship journey to Japan. They arrived at a secret interrogation center near Yokohama called Ofuna. It wasn't officially a POW camp, so the Geneva Convention didn't apply. Here, prisoners were unarmed combatants with no rights whatsoever. They were held in solitary confinement, forbidden to speak, and subjected to relentless psychological and physical torment. But in the oppressive silence of Ofuna, Louis discovered a humming underground of defiance. Prisoners whispered to each other, passed notes, communicated in Morse code by tapping on cell walls. They gave guards mocking nicknames and found small ways to sabotage their captors and reclaim their dignity. Louis was reunited with men he knew, including Commander John Fitzgerald and a brilliant Marine officer named William Harris. But one day he was called into an office and came face to face with someone from his college days, Jimmy Sasaki. Sasaki, Louis now learned, was the head interrogator. He seemed to protect Louis from the worst interrogations. Louis never understood why. After a year at Ofuna, Louis was transferred to a POW camp in Tokyo Bay called Omori. As he stood at the gate on his first day, he was confronted by a Japanese corporal, a handsome, powerfully built man, with a cruel twist to his lips and a chilling wrongness in his eyes. His name was Mutsuhiro Watanabe. The prisoners called him the Bird. The Bird was a sadist in its purest form, a man who found gratification in inflicting pain. He was also consumed by furious resentment of officers, and he singled out Louis, an officer and a famous Olympian, for special persecution. For the next year, the Bird dedicated himself to breaking Louis Zamperini. Every single day, without fail, he would hunt Louis down and beat him. He whipped him with his belt buckle, clubbed him with a kendo stick, punched him senseless. He forced Louis and other officers to clean the latrines with their bare hands. He was a master of psychological torture, changing the rules daily, demanding deference, and then beating men for giving it. Louis refused to break. He met the bird's gaze with defiance, and his refusal to crumble only fueled the corporal's rage. Louis's life became a living hell, a daily battle of wills against a monster. The only glimmers of hope came from the sky, as American B-29 bombers began appearing over Tokyo, a sign the war was turning. The sight of the B-29s drove the bird deeper into madness. His attacks on Louis escalated. One day he ordered Louis to hold a heavy wooden beam over his head. He told a guard that if Louis lowered his arms, he was to be bayoneted. Louis stood there, the beam trembling above him, his eyes locked on the bird. Minute after agonizing minute ticked by. Louis's body was failing, but his will was not. He held that beam for 37 minutes. Finally, the bird, enraged by Louis's endurance, charged him and knocked him unconscious. In early 1945, the bird was transferred from Omori, and for a brief time, Louis and the other prisoners lived in relative peace. But their relief was short-lived. A month later, Louis and several other officers were transferred to a new camp on the remote west coast of Japan, Naoetsu. As they stood in the snow-covered compound on their first day, a man rushed out of an office, screaming. It was the bird. He'd engineered their transfer to have them under his power once again. At Naoetsu, one of the most brutal camps in Japan, the bird's sadism reached its peak. Louis and the other officers were forced into slave labor hauling coal on barges. Louis, already sick and starving, was injured when a guard pushed him off a ramp. The bird then punished him by making him clean the pigsty with his bare hands. He told Louis that if the camp's sickly goat died, he would die too. The beatings were constant and savage. One day, the bird forced every enlisted man in camp, more than 200 of them, to punch Louis and other officers in the face. One by one, Louis was beaten unconscious. He was wasting away from dysentery and beriberi, his body covered in sores, his spirit fraying. He and a group of officers, convinced they were all going to be killed, hatched a plot to murder the bird, tie him to a rock, and throw him in the river. But before they could act, the war came to its sudden, staggering end. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, another destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender. At Naoetsu, the guards kept the news from the prisoners for 5 more days. They were likely awaiting orders on whether to carry out the kill-all decree, a standing order to execute all POWs in the event of invasion or surrender. But on August 20th, an American plane flew over the camp, blinking a message in Morse code. The war is over. The camp erupted. Men ran naked from the river, screaming and crying. They tore down the fences. They were free. The bird, in that moment of chaos, stripped off his uniform, slipped into the countryside, and vanished. Days later, Louis and the other survivors were put on a train to Yokohama. As he stepped onto the platform, he was greeted by American Red Cross nurses. After 2.5 years of torture and starvation, after drifting 2,000 miles across the ocean, after surviving a plane crash that should have killed him, Louis Zamperini was finally going home. But the war wasn't over for him. The bird was gone, but he lived on in Louis's mind. Back in California, Louis was celebrated as a hero, but privately, he was falling apart. He was plagued by horrific nightmares in which the bird returned each night to beat him. He began drinking heavily, trying to drown the memories. His rage was a coiled spring, and he lashed out at the slightest provocation. His marriage to a beautiful, spirited young woman named Cynthia, whom he'd met and married in a whirlwind romance, began to crumble. One night, in a drunken, dream-fueled terror, he woke to find himself on top of his pregnant wife, his hands locked around her neck, strangling her. He had survived the war, but he was losing the peace. His life was consumed by a single, burning obsession: to return to Japan, find the bird, and kill him. Cynthia, unable to watch him destroy himself, decided to file for divorce. But before she left, she attended a sermon by a young evangelist named Billy Graham, who was preaching in a large tent in Los Angeles. She came home transformed and begged Louis to go with her. He refused, but she persisted, and finally, he gave in. He sat in the back of the tent, angry and defensive. But as Graham spoke, something inside Louis began to stir. He was reminded of the promises he'd made to God on the raft, promises he'd long forgotten. He felt the weight of his own brokenness. He stood to leave, but as he reached the aisle, he stopped. In a single, silent moment, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The rage, the fear, the humiliation, it all fell away. He walked down the aisle toward Graham. That night, for the first time in years, the bird did not come into his dreams. He never came again. A year later, in 1950, Louis returned to Japan. He went to Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, where many of his former guards were serving sentences for war crimes. He'd come not for revenge, but to offer forgiveness. As he stood before the men who had tormented him, he saw them not as monsters, but as lost and broken human beings. He felt a deep and genuine compassion for them. He asked where Watanabe was, and was told he'd been found dead, an apparent suicide. As Louis heard the news, he felt only a quiet sense of release. For Louis Zamperini, the war was finally over. The story of Louis Zamperini is, on the surface, a story of incredible physical endurance. It's about a man who survived a plane crash, 47 days on a raft, and 2.5 years of unimaginable torture. But when you look deeper, you realize the real story of Unbroken isn't about what happened to Louis, but what happened inside him. It's a story about 3 powerful ideas: resilience, dignity, and forgiveness. First, resilience. What allows one person to endure the unthinkable, while another, in the exact same circumstances, falls into despair? We see this question play out on the raft with Louis, Phil, and Mac. All 3 faced the same impossible situation. But while Mac saw only hopelessness, Louis and Phil focused on what they could control. They kept their minds active. They talked, planned, told stories. They created a sense of future for themselves, even when the future seemed like an impossible dream. Laura Hillenbrand shows us that resilience isn't some innate quality you're born with. It's a practice. It's the daily choice to focus on what you can do, rather than what you can't. It's the discipline of keeping your mind from surrendering, even when your body is screaming at you to give up. For anyone facing their own challenges, this is a profound lesson. Life will test you, it will push you. The question is, how will you train your mind to respond? The second great theme is dignity. In the POW camps, the Japanese guards, especially the bird, weren't just trying to hurt their prisoners physically. They were trying to strip them of their humanity. They wanted to make them feel worthless, like animals. The beatings, the humiliation, the starvation, it was all designed to break their spirits. And yet Louis and the other prisoners fought back in small, secret ways. They stole newspapers to get war news. They sabotaged their captors. They communicated in code. These weren't just acts of rebellion. They were acts of self-preservation. They were ways of saying, you can control my body, but you cannot control my soul. You can take my freedom, but you cannot take my dignity. It's a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, There's a core part of you that no one can touch, unless you let them. Your dignity is yours to keep. And finally, there's forgiveness. This, to me, is the most powerful lesson in the entire book. Louis came home from the war a hero, but he was a broken man. He was haunted by the memory of the bird, and his life was consumed by a desire for revenge. He thought that killing his tormentor would set him free. But what he discovered is that hatred is its own kind of prison. It chains you to the person who hurt you. The moment he was able to let go of that hate, the moment he was able to look at his former guards with compassion, was the moment he was truly liberated. Forgiveness didn't erase what had been done to him. It didn't excuse the cruelty. What it did was release him from the burden of carrying it. It allowed him to finally leave the war behind. This is a hard lesson, but it's vital. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. True freedom comes not from getting even, but from letting go. So what can you take from this today? First, practice active hope. When things are tough, don't just wish for them to get better. Do what Louis and Phil did on the raft. Keep your mind engaged, talk about the future, and focus on the small things you can control. Second, protect your dignity. No matter what anyone says or does to you, remember that your sense of self-worth comes from within. Find your own small ways to assert your spirit. And third, consider the power of forgiveness. Is there someone in your life you're holding anger toward? Think about what it would mean to let that go. Not for them, but for you. That was a summary of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. We've touched on the incredible journey of Louis Zamperini today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. It can show you the landmarks, but it can't convey the experience of walking the trails, breathing the air, and feeling the sun on your face. The true power of this story lies in the details, in living through those moments with Louis. This summary is here to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've discussed has sparked something in you, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about history. It's an experience that will stay with you, and it might just change the way you think about the strength you have inside yourself. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another life-changing book. Let's keep growing together.